Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. This is an interesting topic, actually, because when we were put together, first of all, it's such a pleasure to be on stage with Samanth. I've been following his work and reading his writing for years, and he's really one of the best in our generation, so it's really an honor. I thought, so they put us together, and we were thinking about what we could do and how we could talk about dystopias and dystopian fiction, non-fiction, how you sort of examine fractured societies. Basically, we're trying to look at how, Samanth has written a brilliant book on Sri Lanka, on the civil war in Sri Lanka called This Divided Island. And in some ways, that is also, it is kind of a dystopic. It has many dystopic elements. And so we thought we could talk, hello? Yeah. We thought we could talk a little bit about our own work and also talk about two texts that have mattered a lot to us. I think I'll be asking Samanth questions on a book called Stasi Land, which is by Anna Funder. It's about East Germany, and it's really a classic of reporting. It's a classic of conflict reporting. And so I'm going to ask him some questions on that. And then he's going to ask me some questions on a book that matters a lot to me, The Life and Times of Michael K. by J.M. Coetzee. And we'll talk about our own work. So.
Yeah, sounds, Okay, that sounds good. So should I go first? Should I ask you a little bit about Coetzee? I mean, so maybe we can start for people who haven't, in the audience who haven't read The Life and Times of Michael K. If you could tell us a little bit briefly about the plot and how it unfolds and what you think is dystopic about it.
Sure. So The Life and Times of Michael K. is, it was written in, I think it won the Booker in 1983, as far as I know.
Yeah, it was written in 1983.
It was written and it won the Booker Prize then. And, it's about, Coetzee is a South African writer, and he was writing about, the book is actually about a race war. Like the society that the story unfolds in is in the midst of this very terrible racial war, which of course in a country like South Africa, writing in South Africa in 1983 would have been, tremendously problematic. But he managed to do it, and the way he goes about it, the way he writes about it is very, very interesting, because the book centers on this one man, Michael K., and his journey. And it starts with his relationship with his mother, and it goes on. And as the book unfolds, you come to realize, the society sort of fills out in front of you as you're reading the book. And when I was reading it, it's not, in terms of plot, there's not a great deal that happens in the book. This man takes a journey. He loses his mother along the way, and he goes off into he finds a farm, and he starts growing his own plants, and he almost starves to death. But in many ways, it is a very, very sharp example of how to write about societies, how to write about deep divisions and conflict without being, ham-fisted, without beating the point, flogging the donkey, as they say, without really, really making your point. And, I think in fiction, it's important to be subtle, even if you have very big points to make, and even if you have very, tremendous, what you feel are very important points, you still need to be very subtle in how you deliver them in fiction and in non-fiction, I think. But I think in fiction, it's a real challenge. And for me, Coetzee was one of those writers who has done it repeatedly and done it so well that I learned a lot from him when I was reading.
Yeah. For me, when I read the book years ago, the one hallmark of what you might call dystopic fiction or any dystopia at all would be the diminishment of the individual human life. Michael K. becomes this man who is basically a pawn in the larger machinations of society. And of course, Coetzee was writing from the point of view of apartheid South Africa, where indeed the black individual life was diminished constantly and often regularly. There is a telling parallel in how Michael K., the name recalls Joseph K. from Kafka, and Kafka talked often about how the individual human life is diminished in front of the state. But I wanted to ask you a little bit about this, and especially as to how you incorporated this when you wrote Leila, which is your own sort of extremely wonderful and moving dystopic novel that came out earlier this year, I believe, or late last year. And, can you talk a little bit about how, in a dystopia as we envision it in fiction, the individual is shrunk down, is marginalized? How does that work, and how did you put it to work in your own book?
Well, actually, when I started writing the novel, then this is before, I'm sure I'd encountered the word dystopia, but, it wasn't something that I was thinking about writing or sort of conceptualize, even when I conceptualized the book. But what I was thinking about was how the state, especially in a country like India, I feel there's oftentimes that the state has so much power over individual lives, over families, and has the power to disrupt and tear people apart in some ways. We feel, we feel protected from that kind of punitive power of the state because we have a certain amount of privilege in India. But there are many people in India whose lives can be disrupted by the state very easily. And I wanted to look at that, and I wanted to look at so what is the essential sort of relationships that we have in our lives? We have our parents, we have our spouses, our children, and I wanted to look at what if the state has that power to, tear apart, as happened in Romania, as happened in many, many totalitarian states. What if they can separate a mother and a child? And, that was the sort of starting point of the book. And when I started looking at that, and of course it took me many years to actually get it right, but when I started looking at that, I started looking at Shalini's story became one of diminishment, as you say. It became about how this woman feels increasingly powerless as she sinks in society.
And what is I guess to backtrack a little bit, when you as a novelist want to respond through fiction to events or trends around you in society that you see, what is the impulse to do it through a dystopic as opposed to a sort of realist novel? Why did you choose one over the other? How does dystopian fiction work better for the reader?
Well, I actually set out to write a realist novel, and then I think a lot of people call it the dystopia because of this thing of the walls that I've added.
There's a speculative element to it. Margaret Atwood said speculative fiction is sort of something that you see around you, but that is not, you can't extrapolate too much from what you already have. It's not science fiction, it's speculative fiction, right?
Yeah, I think it's definitely speculative fiction. But I think when you asked about the difference between writing a sort of realist version or a dystopic version. I think dystopia does allow you certain freedom. When you commit to that form, it allows you certain freedoms. And it allowed me to, once I began to think in terms of, in my novel, I have these sort of 60-foot walls that form around communities, caste-based communities in the city kind of fragments into various divisions. And these walls come up. And in actuality, I feel like this is the way we do live in India already. Our cities, our urban spaces are already fragmented by caste. They are already fragmented by class. And we don't need the walls, actually. The walls are already there in a way, in a sense. I don't want to say they're metaphoric walls, but they are sort of walls that are very powerfully managed to keep certain people out and manage to make sure that they don't feel welcome in a certain space. And so that's why I think I was like writing a kind of realist fiction, because I wasn't writing about a society that is very far, like the classic interpretation of a dystopia is a society, it's an inversion of a utopia. So, it's this society that's very far away, very distant, it's a kind of, when you're reading it or writing it, you can distance yourself from it because you feel like this is not a society I'm writing about. This doesn't exist. But in many ways, I wanted to write about the world I saw around me, about India as I saw it. And even if certain elements are exaggerated or certain things are drawn out, I don't think that I've gone too far away from how people are forced to live in India.
Yeah, that's true. The walls don't actually have to be there in brick and mortar for us to see that they do exist invisibly. Your descriptions of the air and the sky, for example, the pollution. This is something we're used to on a daily basis in Delhi if we visit. It's interesting that you mention the word utopia and that they are sort of flip sides of each other. But in a lot of utopian fiction and in a lot of dystopian fiction, rather, you do find that there are elements of what somebody within the fictional world would consider a utopia. So there are people within Leila's world who think that it is a utopian ideal to live in these communities, that there is a certain, the word purity that occurs again and again. So for people who haven't read the book, purity for all is the motto that everybody talks about all the time. And this purity is achieved through a certain kind of, through this caste segregation, through reproductive segregation, and obviously it's only the elites who achieve that kind of purity. But we tend to think of purity as a very utopian word, that, pure air, for example, is a utopian ideal. And in Leila, people have managed to create what they believe are these pockets of utopia, but that is what gives rise to the dystopia. And is there something you see, this obverse and reverse, that you see kind of coexisting?
I hadn't thought about it in those terms. That's really interesting that you say that. But you're totally right. One person's, it is exactly how it works, because there are so many people who are champions of that system, who, for whom it is. I think there's a little, there's a statement that one of the, the members of the council makes, who says, like now people from Singapore come and look at our fly roads. We set up these models of development. We set up these models of achievement or progress of society, that this is where the benchmarks, that this is where we should be. And Singapore or America, whatever, are those kind of benchmarks. And, we tend to ignore. And so, those become the utopic kind of, and I see this I grew up in Delhi, I see it in Bombay, there's a kind of craving for this Western lifestyle, or there's a craving for this, there's an aspiration that we could live like people in the West live, or we could live like, like people in the West or people in rich countries live, and a determination to ignore how the rest of the society has to live, because we live in this kind of utopia. It's very, and I think that's where, in a city like Delhi, we have all these flyovers which have now started almost to connect with one another. So it's almost like you're driving above the city in a sense. You're driving along on this around maybe 60 feet or 40 feet, 50 feet above the city, and you can go up and down, up and down. You never have to get into the city in a sense. You never have to really embrace what the city has and what it smells and its angers and all of that. And I think that was, for me, I was trying to show Shalini first living in that cocooned world, and then being forced to, encounter each of the smells and each of the, depredations of that, the sort of the ground realities of India.
Yeah, because I think the corollary for that would be every utopia is a dystopia for somebody. And not only is that the case in sort of speculative fiction like this, but it's very inherently true even in modern day real world India, or even anywhere else, right? We seem to be living in one version of the world all the time, but our version of the world is already dystopic to somebody else somewhere else who often encounters it on the fringes.
Yeah, definitely. I think so, yeah. You're totally right.
Okay, let's push this point forward a little more. Is the human quest for utopia inherently dystopic? By which I mean, is that achievable? This is something that we've been, the word utopia is a Greek word. People have been thinking about for 2,000 years or more. Right. Thomas More wrote this book, Utopia, more than 200 years ago. So the question of whether this, we all crave this utopian ideal. Everybody thinks about it. Scientists think about it. Philosophers, artists, everybody dreams about this particular world in which social conditions are somehow ideal for everyone. And is the quest for that and the reaching for that itself a dystopic process?
I think that is the job of us as writers. As writers, we tend to interrogate those ideas, those aspirations. If a philosopher, I don't know about a philosopher, but if a scientist has this kind of utopic idea, I think that kind of drives a lot in science. It drives a lot. That aspiration drives a lot of progress. For societal progress and all of that. But it's our job. I'm thinking when you said science, you brought in the science, I was thinking of Aldous Huxley's book, Brave New World. Yeah. And, he interrogates that idea so well that even in this sort of, this drug-administered, perfect society, things fall apart very quickly, and things can, it's just a surface perfection. And as novelists or as non-fiction, non-fiction writers, it's our job to look at that. I mean, if you look at Sri Lanka right now, there is, I went to Sri Lanka, and I'm going to come to this and ask you about this, but I was in Sri Lanka, my wife and I were in Sri Lanka a couple of years ago, last year, and in some senses it is very much like that. There are people, it is in one sense a Sinhalese utopia now, it does feel like a place that is outside, that has achieved a kind of ethnic solidarity via this war, whatever it is. They have achieved this thing that they wanted, which is the Sinhalese, utopia. And what does that mean for the Muslims there, for the Tamils there? What does that mean which is what you interrogate in your book so well?
Yeah. I mean, there was another third book that we wanted to talk about, which was The Handmaid's Tale, which maybe we will get to if we have time. But, I'm sure many of you in the audience have read the book or seen the TV show. And that's another example of what I had talked about earlier, which is this quest for people, or the tendency of human beings to create what they see as utopias in the middle of widespread, whether it's carnage in the case of war, or spoilage in the case of the environment, or in the case of The Handmaid's Tale, like sort of biological inability to have children anymore, the rarity of that, of that ability. And so somehow human beings are able to construct out of this some sort of hierarchy of norms, some pseudo-religious, explanation and rationalization for these norms. And that's what we do inherently as social beings. This is who we are. In the middle of dystopia, we create these little bubbles for ourselves.
And that begs the question of whether, how far we are from dystopias at any moment in time, are we already justifying this to ourselves, however we're living or whatever it is? Is there already kind of internal justifications that we're doing to be able to live in whatever society we live in?
Yeah, and now more than ever, when The Handmaid's Tale came out, the book came out in 1985, and then the TV show came out, of course, during the Trump administration, and there were so many parallels already that people were seeing between the world of the show, this sort of slightly theocratic, slightly crazed world, and the world of the Trump administration.
So now I think I'm going to ask you a few questions.
Okay.
Yeah? Okay, great. So, and we'll talk a bit about dystopias, of course, but I wanted to, I don't get often the chance to interrogate someone, so I want to first talk to you about This Divided Island, which really is a very remarkable book. I think, how many years did you spend in Sri Lanka? A year or two?
So I moved there in the summer of 2011, and I lived there for about 10 months continuously. And then I used to go back. I made a couple of extra trips from Delhi, where I was living at the time, and I did more reporting and so on. But the book took essentially from about 2010 to 2014.
It was out in 2014, I remember. And so, could you tell us a little bit about the book? Could you tell us, about the Civil War, how you came to the project?
For people who are sort of perhaps not, as alive to the dynamics of Sri Lankan politics, which I don't blame you if you are not, the Sri Lankan Civil War started in 1983, and it ran until 2009, and it ended in the summer of 2009 in a massive sort of orgy of bloodletting. It was one of those rare wars when one side actually wins quite decisively in a civil war. So the government cracked down on and ultimately erased this group of guerrillas that had been fighting for a Tamil homeland in the north and the east. And I'm Tamilian from India, not from Sri Lanka, but I'm a Tamil from India. And so throughout the time that I was growing up, this conflict and its dynamics and its evolution was very close to what I would read in the newspapers every day, the news that I would get from friends who were Sri Lankan. And I went there finally in 2011, 2 years after the war ended, because driving me was this essential curiosity of what happens in a society and what happens to a society and to people who have lived through 26 years of, fairly non-stop war. There were a few ceasefires there in the middle, but it's almost as if an entire generation grows up knowing nothing but your country at war with other countrymen. And I was curious as to what that does to memory, to society, to families, to individuals, to psychology. And so I went there and I traveled around the island and I lived in various parts and I wrote about ordinary people. The idea was never to provide an exhaustive history of the war or to talk to people who were at the very top of the government or the army or anything like that. It was more to talk about individual life stories and individual histories.
Well, that's what actually you bring out so well, because it's all conversations with Sinhalese people, with Tamils over there who've had this experience. And, this book is full of, it's very well written, of course, and it's full of these very remarkable turns of phrase and vivid imagery. There's a lot of very vivid, brutal images, almost brutal images. And I was looking through the book the other day, and I came across this phrase, Sri Lanka was a country pretending that it had been suddenly scrubbed of violence. And I thought that was, it just put me in mind of my own trip to Sri Lanka, my first trip to Sri Lanka a couple of years ago, because again, those highways, the new Chinese-built highways and all, and it did feel, it is in some respects very clean country, but I kept thinking it was a country that was, cleansed instead of clean, in that sense, like, because you don't see any expressions of Tamil culture really. I didn't see any expressions of Tamil culture. I didn't see any. You see Rajapaksa was everywhere, though he wasn't in power when I went, but his face was everywhere, like sort of dominating these highways. And I began to think about, do you think that I guess I worry because we are in our own sort of cultural foment at this moment. But do you think that that's a country that has successfully implemented that agenda of silencing a minority or of, subjugating a minority to that extent where they don't feel assertive enough to say anything, because now over the years we've seen under this government and all, that the Muslim community taking a step back on various issues that it was very vocal about earlier, like Ram Mandir, like triple talaq also. I'm not no supporter of triple talaq, but you know what I'm saying? Like these were big contentious issues 5 or 7 years ago or 10 years ago, but now the Muslim community tends to be silent about that, and I just wonder about the parallels.
I mean, it's difficult to, for me at least, it's difficult to come to a conclusion one way or another about modern Sri Lanka, because unquestionably the actual end of fighting in 2009 unquestionably is a good thing. I mean, there's no doubt. I mean, there are no more children being ripped from their parents to join the Tigers. There is no sort of, the stop and checks on a lot of the roads in Sri Lanka have stopped, they have ended. And so we can't minimize that. I think there are a lot of people in Sri Lanka who, however unhappy they are with the present government, are unquestionably glad and satisfied by the fact that there is no outright fighting. Having said that, and things have changed in interesting ways. So the government that ended the war, the president, Mahinda Rajapaksa, who was something of an autocrat, he was voted out of power a few years after the war ended, about maybe 4 or 5, I think 5 years after the war ended. And that was, it was a slightly surprising turn of events. I mean, nobody expected it. Everybody expected that an autocrat would rig the elections well enough to remain in power. That didn't happen. And so that was a moment of sort of hope and optimism. The people who ran against him and defeated him said that they would address these big questions of war crimes, of giving Tamil regions more civil liberties, of writing a new constitution, and these processes did begin. And so at that moment, all you want to say, particularly as a Sri Lankan, although I don't want to speak for them, but definitely as somebody who'd been observing this, all you want to say is, well, look, if the process starts, that's a good thing, and it doesn't matter how slow it is as long as it goes forward meaningfully. And then that forward progress stopped, or sort of went so slow.
When was this exactly you're talking about?
Well, so I mean, the election, I think it was like 2014 and 2015, there were two separate elections. And that was when there was this big efflorescence of optimism and hope. And then things stopped, and now there's a sort of huge new political controversy in Sri Lanka where the president seems to be inviting Rajapaksa back to form the government. That has proved to be unconstitutional and unpopular. So, things have frozen again. And in the meantime, what has happened is a lot of the promises that were made were obviously not kept. The rewriting of the new constitution has stalled. The army still controls large pockets of the north and the east, which is where the Tamils are concentrated for the most part. They own vast acres of land in all of these places, so they control the livelihood of people who depend on that land. And so it's a different kind of dystopia that has started to emerge over there. It's not the outright open dystopia of war, but it's something that is more insidious and perhaps harder to deal with.
I mean, there's economic controls and social controls. You know, I mean, in some ways that's so frightening. You know, in many ways it's very frightening, and perhaps not as frightening as out and out war, but you know, it is, as you say, it's very insidious, and it has this kind of genuine impact. You know, people will grow up without the ability to speak, you know, to feel, to think freely, or you know, speak freely. And
I mean, it's also at the same time, again, after the new government came to power, the civil liberties of ordinary citizens did improve. You know, so it's difficult to judge, and that's what makes this particular kind of you know, under the surface dystopia so difficult to grapple with. You know, you don't know sort of how to judge it overall. You don't know how to weigh it, because there are some things that are evidently freer, and there are other things that are not, and it's difficult to know how to judge them and weigh them and value them.
Right. I felt when I was there that there was a lot of silences around, you know, around the war and all of that. But in your book, you bring out so beautifully this, you know, there are these characters who are very voluble, like they speak a lot about the war and they're very keen to jump into the conversation. So how do you go about, like, you know, in a society like Sri Lanka, post-Civil War, how do you go about, as in a reporter, as in, you know, as someone who's gone there to investigate this matter, how do you know, like, you know, who to talk to, and you know, who's going to be the Sinhalese Stasi or whatever, like?
Yeah, I mean, it was tricky, because as I say in the book, I was Indian, I was Tamil, and I was a journalist. That's three sins in Sri Lanka, right there. You can't get over those sins. But you know, part of the reason I moved there and lived there and sort of decided to just, you know, insinuate myself into society was because I felt that was the only way to get people to trust me. So there were some people who would, you know, who I would be introduced to, who, because of the introduction through a friend or a colleague or whatever, they would, you know, people would start to open up. Other people I had to visit, you know, 10, 11 times before they finally, you know, one guy on his 10th or 11th conversation told me that he used to be a member of the Tigers. And this was, you know, I'd hung out with him for afternoons on end, eating lunch and drinking tea and so on. And 10 meetings later, he admits to what he used to do. So a lot of it is just the investment of time. And I guess the evident, you have to sort of prove to them that you are worth telling their stories to.
Of course, yeah. That you'd be faithful to the stories. That,
yeah, and you're willing to sort of invest the kind of patience and time that it requires.
There was, you know, early in the book, there's this very beautiful description of you encountering this photograph from Colombo in '83. You know, this Tamil man being attacked by a mob, and you talk about your own reaction to it. And for me, that was, you know, I think we discussed this a couple of days ago also. But you know, for me, I felt that this was really a starting point for you. You know, because do you think that I'm thinking of the photograph of Godhra in 2002 also, you know, the very famous iconic image of that man with his hands, for the tailor from Gujarat, you know, with his hands folded. And do you think that wars and conflicts like this, they become so savage, you know, the savagery takes on this kind of complexity, and it becomes very inhuman, you know, it becomes so inhuman that, you know, for the rest of the world, for people outside that little war zone, for the rest of the world to understand it, or even to humanize it again, we need those kind of, you know, these frames, these images, these kind of frames or moments. We need pieces of, you know, like, as writers, as journalists, as fiction writers, our job is necessarily a kind of reductive process, right? You see this kind of huge thing, and you filter down to a certain narrative, to one line of investigation within this huge thing. So do you think that is what the actual job of writers and photographers and artists is to, you know, to sort of shrink this very complex and horrifying thing, inhuman thing, into something that can be humanized again, into something that can be...
I mean, the shrinking is inevitable. You have 300 pages, you have one photo frame, you have, you know, 80,000 words or whatever. There are clearly things you have to leave out. But I think part of the mandate is the opposite, is to sort of, you know, if it's messy and if there are loose ends and stray threads out there in the real world, I mean, your mandate is really to capture that and to capture the looseness and the messiness and the complexity, even if you don't understand it yourself. And I think, particularly as outsiders, definitely as an outsider to Sri Lanka, there was no way I could sort of reconstruct the lived experience of that war. Nobody can really unless they've actually lived through it. So what I chose as my duty was to capture even my own struggles to capture it, in a sense. There's this moment in the book where somebody is telling me a story about how he was in a massacre in a mosque. And he asks me this question about how my writing about this will help him in any way at all. And this is something that, as a journalist, you have to grapple with quite often. And the truth is, there is no answer. I mean, you can offer glib responses about how this is, speaking truth to power, or bearing testimony on behalf of people who can't give it. But the truth is really that, his life is just going to proceed exactly the way it has for the last 25 odd years. And, to even capture that moment of lack of clarity, I think, is telling in one way. And I think that's an important thing for the reader to know as well.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah. So I wanted to also talk a bit about Stasiland, because it's such a wonderful book.
Yes.
And your book is similar in some ways and very different in a lot of others. So the first thing is, again, about the craft. Now, and this is perhaps a mischievous question, so if you don't want to answer it, you don't have to. But I've always wondered this. And so how much fiction is there in, these long-form non-fiction narratives? Like, how much of what I mean is, I don't mean to say like, like that guy who got in trouble in Afghanistan, James Frey was his name? No, I don't mean like that. But what I mean is that, Stasi's Land starts with this kind of very famous set piece where, she's hungover, she walks into the station in Berlin, she goes to the bathroom and she's talking to this woman who's the attendant there. And that woman makes this very perfect comment. She says something about, oh, the Berlin Wall is down and I want to go see the Great Wall of China. And for me, and then Anna Fanda goes on this very remarkable investigative journey. She starts her journey and she goes and meets she gets on the train and goes and meets this person. And so what I mean is there a lot, when you're writing a narrative like this, is there a lot of collapsing timelines? Do you have to bring various moments together? Do you have to collapse timelines? Do you have to combine characters? Because I know you do this in fiction a lot. In fiction, you have to combine characters sometimes. You have to, you do sort of change the way timelines work. And is that something you had to do in nonfiction to make it a coherent narrative? Because
well, okay. So Stasiland, for people who have yet to read the book, Stasiland is Anna Fanda is an Australian writer. And when she was very young, I think in the late 80s or early 90s, she moved to Berlin to study and then to work. And she started to hear more and more about how the Stasi, which is the East German secret service, I believe, the secret police, turned everybody. Basically, East Berlin or East Germany as a whole was a society of informers. You informed on each other. You were recruited to tell on your neighbor or your wife or your son and so on. And like me, I think, in the same kind of basic impulse that I followed, her own basic impulse was to see what this did to human relations and to the fabric of society when something like that happened over a long period. And so she goes and she talks to people who were, again, not high-ranking functionaries in the Stasi, but just sort of mid-level, runners of agents. She talks to mid-level agents. She talks to people who tried to make a break for it and failed or succeeded. And she tells these very intimate stories that creates this overall mood where you think, okay, look, almost like milk floating on the surface of, skin floating on the surface of milk. You pick the skin up and there's all this sort of, the substance below that you have to examine. And she examines the rot below the skin in sort of post-reunification Germany or East Germany. So I was very taken with this, and I was taken in particular by the methods that she used to tell her story. Because if you read Stasiland, it reads very much like a novel. It reads there are fictive elements to it, even if they're not fictional elements. And I can't obviously speak for Stasiland itself, but when I started this Divided Island, I thought, okay, well, how would it be to write a book like that? To kind of write it as if it's a novel, with the kind of characters and scenes and dramatic arcs that novelists employ, but without sacrificing an ounce of journalistic integrity, which means that you don't collapse timelines and you don't collapse characters, definitely, and you don't, maybe you don't explicitly go in chronological order all the time, but you always make it clear to the reader when something happened or why it happened. So at least for me, I think that's non-negotiable. But there are people who do it extremely well. I read this book called Red Plenty by Francis Pufford, which is an excellent book. Francis Pufford is a British writer, and Red Plenty is his story of the Soviet agricultural program. He talks about these big plans to revolutionize Soviet agriculture, to boost production, to boost industrial production, to move towards, ironically enough, a utopia where everybody is well-fed and happy and the machines are running and the trains go on time and so on. But he does this marvelous little thing where he picks real characters or semi-real characters and he puts them in real settings, and he then moves them around in imaginary dialogues and scenes and situations. And he interpolates them with actual hardcore economic and technical analysis of what was happening in the Soviet Union at the time. And his characters are, in that sense, they are fictional characters, and he is a novelist moving them around. And it's extremely effective. It really sort of brings you into the immediate surroundings of these characters and their workplaces and their home lives and their troubles and their love lives. But it is a novel. There's no doubt. I mean, it's like ink in water. If there's one thing that's made up in the book, I believe it's fiction.
Right. Yeah, no, that I thought that was the distinction,
Yeah.
But I think recently that boundaries being blurred more and more.
Yeah.
Well, by some writers. But I'm glad that you're clear about what you do. So there was, another thing that I felt was interesting was. And Anna Funder was writing about this kind of system that had already expired in a sense. She was writing about East Germany. She'd gone there in '96, I think, when she gone there to write the book. So, and so she's kind of picking apart in the detritus of this failed system. This system is gone, and she's looking at people who can be free to talk about it. Of course, there is the difference between, I feel, without being too sort of culturally determinant, I felt there was a big difference between how German people would talk about something like this and how Sri Lankan people would talk about something like this. It seemed like the characters in your book were so eager to talk about it, whereas she had to really, elicit information or answers from people who've been through this very repressive regime. But, when you were writing about a government and leaders and, and a community still very much in power, and, like this, and in it, so do you think that that led you to some unique challenges that posed something that was of a different order than what she had to face?
Yeah, I mean, there were the obvious sort of logistical challenges, which are just that you go to a country like this as a journalist. It's not always the best idea to tell them you're a journalist. So I went on tourist visas, and I would renew my visa and stay on pretending to be a tourist. At some point, I mean, very early on in the process, I realized I had to be very careful who I spoke to on the phone and what I said, because phones are bugged in a country like that. And so you learn that very quickly. And you learn, more than anything else, you learn that you had to be careful about the safety of the people you were talking to. Not only because, very often non-journalists, and particularly people who've lived through a war and have gone through difficult times, aren't always alive to the nuances of off the record and background and deep background and so on. I mean, very often they just want to tell you their story and move on. And it, unfortunately or fortunately, it devolves on you to figure out, whether they will be safe doing this or, how to negotiate that part of it. And so that was this was the first time I was doing any writing like this at a book level, and I had to do a lot of that, making judgments like that. But beyond that, I felt like, the nature of the narrative itself was something I had to think about, because the government was still in power when I went there. Rajapaksa was still very much in power, and I had to decide for myself whether there was anything to be gained by talking to people in that administration. This was an administration that is undoubtedly going to lie to you. It's never going to sort of admit upfront what they said or did or anything of that sort. And so the question becomes, can you tell a narrative like this without the participation of people at the very top of this hierarchy? The Tigers, the guerrilla group, their leaders had all been eliminated in any case. So it was very difficult to get to them. But the generals and the politicians were still around. And of course, talking to them would mean admitting that I'm a journalist who's there illegally. I would get thrown out, so there was that aspect of it. But I did, I took heart again to go back to Swaziland from what she did, which is to tell the story bottom up, is to talk to people at the grassroots, ordinary people, everyday people whose lives were bent or distorted or shattered one way or another by the war, and to get them to tell their stories and somehow piece it together like a mosaic and see if you can get a bigger picture to pop out at you. Well, let me ask you this question, since we're on the subject of journalism. You are a journalist, and you have been a journalist for a while now. And it is undoubtedly for every nonfiction writer out there that I know, it is the holy grail to proceed towards fiction at some point, and you have done that. So, well done. And there's some of us who are still struggling to negotiate that transition in any way whatsoever. But why? I'd asked you earlier why you responded to modern India through a dystopic as opposed to a realist novel, but now I ask you why respond through fiction as opposed to non-fiction? If these stories are out there of parts of societies that are alienated or marginalized, and these trends are out there of, caste-based communities and so on, why respond through it? What are the advantages that fiction provides?
Well, I think it's an interesting question. I always, on one level, I always wanted to write fiction. It's been a dream of mine since I was a child. So, I think that was the sort of starting point, was that I would write. If I tried to write a book, I would end up writing fiction. I always had that idea in my head. But when I came to it, I think with Laila itself, with the book itself, I think what it allowed me to do was really take on this idea. I think in a country like India, we have this, if you're born in privilege, if you're born in, and I don't mean like you have to be born very wealthy or, born in, but just a kind of caste privilege or a certain level of economic privilege, there's a kind of safety net that extends around you, that because of your education, because of things that would prevent you from falling to the real bottom of society. There's always something that keeps you afloat. There's your alumni network or something, you will have a job. Whereas in a country like America, where I went to college, it's conceivable that a Harvard graduate could end up homeless, could end up on the streets, whatever. It is, I guess, sort of conceivable that it could happen. Whereas in India, I feel like we have these kind of protective layers. There are these protective networks that prevent that. And I wanted to look at what if that disappears? What if that disappears, and what if someone in India, it's almost inconceivable to find a story like Shalini's, right? Of a woman who is at the top of society and then suddenly has no access to any power, no access to any resources, is a totally alone. She's searching for her daughter through this book, but she's not even able to, she's not able to talk to her husband's family. She's not able to talk to anyone, basically, and she's totally alone. What happens, because she can't talk to her friends, because, she's been cast out of society in a very, I don't want to use a pun, but she has literally been cast out of society. So she needs to, she needs to negotiate this new world. And for me, it was almost impossible to imagine that in a non-fictional setting, in a setting that, amongst people I knew or people, people I met, it was almost impossible to think of that. So I think the fictional, I don't know which one came first, but I think the fictional thing really lent itself. Choosing to go with fiction lent itself to the story I was writing quite well. It just sort of fit together well.
And how long did you think about the story itself? When did you start? When did it sort of germinate in your mind? When did it come together?
I think my wife has an answer for that question, but many years. I spent I started writing, and then I went off and worked with Naresh Fernandez at Scroll for a while and had a great job there. That was, so, but when you're working at a website, at a news website, you get no time at all to write for your own writing. So there was, I had to keep taking breaks. I came back to it. And then eventually I quit my job, and I think all in all, I must have spent 4 or 5 years on the book, thinking about it and putting it away and struggling. We have the same editor and the same agent, dealing with our wonderful editor, horrible editor, whatever it is.
Okay, I'm not sure how much time we have left, but we should take questions. 20 minutes? Should we take questions? Yeah? Okay, we can take questions and we can sort of feed off of that to talk more as well if anything strikes us. Not all at once now, please. Just like. Yes, sir. Oh, do we have a mic for?
This may not be a very flattering thing to say, but what attracted me to this session was the use of the word dystopia in the heading. Now, I spent quite a little bit of my time in art, and now no matter which art you're reading about, it's very difficult to escape the word dystopia. Now, I'm wondering whether this is like a word which has become a la mode. I mean, you sprinkle it here and there and look intellectual, or as you mentioned in passing, is it there is utopia and there is dystopia. And if I take the equivalent, there's heaven and hell. But in between, you interpose this thought of the normal world. So the normal world, that is dystopia as opposed to the normal world. So I was wondering, can you give us a good handle on dystopia itself so that the next time you read the word, we have a good feel for what it means?
Yeah, kind of. Life is lived between utopia and dystopia, but go ahead.
I think dystopic societies I think the term implies a society that has failed in certain fundamental ways, that where, things have fallen apart to an extent that it's not, it's, the word utopia. Utopia means it's idealized, very ideal society, and a dystopia is this kind of society where things have stopped working, things that you expect to work have stopped working in certain ways that make it almost unlivable for certain people. And as someone pointed out, there's almost no place that is inherently dystopic. It's there are certain, for some people who feel, the people with power feel that it's a utopia, and there are certain people who feel it's a dystopia. So you have this, I think it's very interesting because if in my novel, if I'd chosen to write about someone at the top of the society, possibly it would have been this kind of, a very different novel. Mm-hmm. So I think, and there is a lot of art right now that is coming out. There's a lot of fiction, there's a lot of actual visual art that is coming out around dystopias. And I think that's also a reflection of, global politics. There is a lot that's going on in the world that we're trying to understand, in various parts of the world, not only in the West, not only in India, not only in the West, but basically across the world, South America, there's so.
I mean, it's interesting. It's very interesting you said this because it just struck me while you were talking that and based on what you said earlier about Leila, dystopia always implies a fall. It is a fall for somebody who has previously been in some sort of semi-utopia or in some sort of privilege. I mean, for other people who are born into their own dystopia, it's just life, right, unfortunately. But right from the Judeo-Christian sort of version of Eden and their expulsion from Eden and so on, that is a big prominent idea that we think of. Dystopia automatically means something gets worse and far worse. So I think maybe it's a transition into a lower and more broken state of society that we're talking about here.
I think if you think of Handmaid's Tale, there is, Atwood doesn't concentrate, she's not very interested in the previous society, but I think I spend more time, talking about that previous world. But she's very, she builds it very quickly, but she does it very well. But I think that's necessary. You need to have that as your sort of, as you say, to demonstrate the fall, to show the freedoms before, to show, how things can change.
And she's very clear because I think by not focusing on the before world, the utopia, so to speak, she allows the reader to imagine that utopia is our society now. And then she demonstrates that actually a lot of the elements of the dystopia to come are already present in the so-called utopia of today.
Well,
Thank you for a fascinating conversation. I'm interested to hear a little bit more about the transformation between journalism to fiction. And especially when in the novel you speak about Shalini going to look for her daughter in Deonar, in the landfill. And she goes into those huts and she looks for her daughter and you describe it so vividly. And I'm wondering what kind of research process goes into capturing the lives of the disadvantaged, the oppressed?
Well, I mean, I spent quite a few years as a reporter, 6, 7 years, and I was drawn to stories like this. I did spend, I mean, I did write a lot about social, social disparities in India, and I was interested in examining that. But, I would go off to sort of, I don't know, from Delhi, I would go traveling to Jharkhand and try and, I did a couple of stories on the Musahars and things like that. So you do get to see certain slices of life. But then I found actually the most informative process for when I was writing the book was actually living in Bombay. Because, in Delhi, where I grew up, you have these kind of segregations, you have colonies, you have neighborhoods, and then you get in your car and you drive to your office or whatever, and you get in your bus and you drive to office, and you're kind of moving from one cocoon to another all the time. But in a city like Bombay, because it's much more compressed, you'll have this sort of whatever upper middle class building, and right in front on the street you'll have you'll have a shanty, and you'll see on that same street you'll have a shanty, and you can look inside the homes. You can see really. And I remember my wife pointing out to me many years ago, look how neat the homes are. Maharashtrian people keep these homes very pristine, always. They're all, and it was something that stayed with me. And I immediately, it's sort of embedded in my consciousness, and I always noticed that. And when I wrote the book, it was something that, when I was writing this about the outside world, one of the things I wanted to write about was inside that woman's house, Sapna's house, it's very clean and it's very neat and it's very ordered, because when you live in those kind of small spaces, you need to be like that. It's important to be like that. And so these are things that, you keep your eyes open, even when you're not reporting, try and always you have that. But I think that training really helped, to have that kind of thing and to be able to go out and search for those stories.
I remember isn't there some kind of re-education camp in Life and Times of Michael K. also? Doesn't he go to a camp at some point?
Yeah, he does. Well, I think that is a kind of a classic of dystopic fiction, the re-education camp. But mine was, I think, because, we have these camps in India. Just to explain a bit, Shalini is, she's taken to this camp, she's separated from a child, her husband is killed because she marries a Muslim man. She's Hindu and she marries a Muslim man. And so we actually have these Shuddhi camps or whatever, these where women are taken from, in Madhya Pradesh, because we have an anti-conversion law in Madhya Pradesh, or, so and there was a woman from Kerala who was very famously taken also. Yeah. So, and it's set up in a center. So we have these centers. It's not that these things don't exist in India. The one in Life and Times of Michael K. is fantastically done, because, I remember this one thing very clearly. It comes around maybe in the middle of the book, or, or so. And that is only, in Kuchi has this kind of, the entry, the official log entry is Michael K. /40 unemployed and /CM, and which stands for colored male, which is obviously a very, very politically potent term in South Africa. But, that's the first time you realize this is not a white man. He doesn't make it clear throughout the book. It's a story about a race war. There are no racial slurs, there's no kafir, all the South African terminology that you associate with that war. There's none of that. He manages to excise all of that, but still build this very, very wonderful, important story about race in South Africa. And you need a writer of his talent to be able to do something like that. But, it's inspirational in that way.
Samanth, you talked about...
Hi, sorry, I didn't see you.
Yeah. You talked about how you had to meet this person 10 times before he told you the 11th time, and how you had to blend in. Could you talk in a little more detail about how it was and what the experience was like, and as an Indian, as a journalist, how you managed to broaden your network, how you managed to meet these different people, and what it was like?
Well, I went there not knowing precisely who I wanted to meet. I didn't know the names of people, but in my mind, I started to put together like sort of ideas of the kind of people I wanted to meet. So, for example, one of the chapters in the book is about a Tamil officer in the Sri Lankan army, And he was in the army until sort of the late 90s, I believe, and he got a little disillusioned with it, and he left, and he, so I knew this kind of people existed, I just didn't know any particular names. But I thought it would be interesting to ask what it was like. I mean, you're a Tamil, but you're in the army. The army is discriminating against your community even as you're serving them, and you are fighting against, essentially, people who are fighting for your community. And so I would ask around for, I would talk to other journalists, I would talk to people in NGOs. My friends were sort of a fairly diverse lot over there, so I would ask them. That would be lawyers and so forth. And I would go to Tamil organizations and I would say, look, I'm looking for this kind of person. And I got a couple of leads that way, which was great. With this guy in particular, I was put onto him by somebody in India who said, he's sort of a poet and a writer and you should go and meet him. And that was all I knew about him. And I went there, and the first time I went and met him, we sat in the courtyard. It's very funny. We sat in the courtyard of his house, and we had lunch, and he said, listen, why don't you come back tomorrow? So I came back tomorrow, the next day. We had lunch again. So by this time, I had spent like 7 hours or 8 hours over the course of 2 days. And then as I'm leaving on the second day, he says, you should be careful because they're watching my house. And I said, you should have told me this at the beginning, not after like our second meeting in 2 days. But then that turned, I think, we sort of enjoyed talking to each other. And I realized very quickly that he was not going to be the kind who would just sort of spill everything from day one. He would ask me questions, and he would ask me what I did and my thoughts on this and that, and I would provide this to him. And slowly I got the sense, maybe by our fourth meeting, I got the sense that there was more to tell, and he wasn't telling it. So I said, okay, I have time to kill. So I kept going back to him, and I kept sort of chipping away one layer after another. Always, we'd sit in the courtyard of his house in Jaffna. We'd have lunch always at his house. He was an English teacher, to earn money. That's what he did. So people would come in and he would teach them English. But we would talk in Tamil, and his Tamil was very literary and very difficult to pass, and I really struggled to make sense of it initially. He would be, he was the kind of guy who thought in political ideologies. So he would describe people very easily as, I'm trying to think of the exact, he is a Marxist. And so that was supposed to explain everything about him. Or like, he's a Leninist, that kind of thing. And I had to kind of ask him what that meant. So, and over the course of these meetings over several weeks, finally, I think he started to realize he could trust me. And it didn't always go this way. I mean, a lot of the times people were much more eager to talk to anyone at all, and they would just talk. So it was, you had to kind of feel your way around. And I think, as I said, the only way to do this is if you have time to invest. So,
I have a quick question on that. Was there a process of disillusionment for you also when because you write so well about the tigers and, the kind of, the infractions, the social infractions, the kind of pressures they put on their own community, to sustain this war, to fight this war. Was there a process? Because in India, I remember growing up in the 80s and 90s, like there's, we did glamorize the tiger movement to a certain extent. There was a valorification of it, and this kind of thing. They're fighting for Tamil rights or whatever, and they're fighting for freedom, and of course not looking at Kashmir at all, but but valorizing that. Was there a process of disillusionment as you came to see these kind of really horrible infractions at the Tamil, or were you already aware when you went?
I think I was aware to a certain extent. I mean, this was after all a group that had killed one of our ex-prime ministers right here, outside my city of Madras. So there was no way I was unaware of what they were capable of. And even sort of the most basic histories of the Sri Lankan war will tell you about sort of the big central bank bombing, for example. They drove a truck through the bank gates and exploded it, and many civilians died. So this was definitely something they were capable of. And the second point that I wanted to make was that while going there, unlike possibly a lot of other Tamils, I didn't feel like I had a dog in that fight. I didn't feel sort of particularly inclined to support the Tamil cause, or even if I supported the cause, I definitely didn't support the methods by which the tigers try to fight for it. Violence in any case, in any form, particularly the kind that kills and harms civilians, it's a no-go area. And so, there was no disillusionment. There was, the minute I heard about that stuff, I knew that it was something to be criticized rather than just sort of implicitly and completely supported. Yeah.
I remember the one in Canada. Was he in Toronto?
Yeah.
The tiger.
Yeah.
And it's a very beautiful section of
the Tamil soldier who was in the army. Yeah.